Hi, everybody who's attending. Welcome to my session, Fabric Through the Eyes of a Power BI Pro. My name is Anne. I work as a lead consultant at a company called Today, and we're a Nordic company. We are a consultancy firm, and we work with technology and, of course, with data platforms and Power BI and all that good stuff. I am based in Oslo. I'm not in Oslo right now. I am in my hometown, Ålesund, and the weather has just been so shifting today. Right now it's raining and just very windy. So I have like a really beautiful view of the rain where I'm sitting right now. I've been working with data since 2019. And Martha, who's my mentor, she said, you need something personal about yourself on this slide here. So in my spare time, I like to start reading books. I'm not as good at finishing them as I am at starting them. And I also run a small wine blog with some of my friends. So my session today is about viewing Fabric through the eyes of a Power BI professional. And when I say Power BI professional, that can mean a lot of things. Some people who are Power BI professionals, they are like super hardcore developers and they know everything about automation and continuous integration, all that stuff. And some people who are maybe considering themselves Power BI professionals are more business users, or they've just made a few simple reports themselves, but they've never actually touched any of the sort of backend stuff of Power BI. And this session aims at the people who are somewhere in between that. People who know Power BI pretty well, but they don't know maybe a lot about Fabric. So what we're going to be looking at and talking about today is a little bit about what Fabric actually is, just to put everybody on the same page. And then we're going to jump into what is familiar inside Fabric to somebody who's worked with Power BI. We're going to talk about what is familiar to what is unfamiliar to a Power BI Pro inside Fabric. And maybe that's the kind of thing you want to look into a little bit more if you want to get to know Fabric better. And we're also going to focus on some Power BI functionality that is has been launched with Fabric that is like specific to Power BI. So let's just jump right into it. What is Fabric? Whenever I talk to people about Fabric, if they don't know what it is, I like to say that it's this new end-to-end analytics platform from Microsoft. But the thing is, it's not actually that new anymore. It was announced back in 2023 in May, and since then, they've been developing this thing like you wouldn't believe. But it is an end-to-end analytics platform from Microsoft, and it's delivered as a software as a service. And even though the brand Fabric is fairly new, the technology behind Fabric is probably going to be very familiar to people who's been working with data platform in Azure for a while. It combines some known technologies such as Azure Synapse and Azure Data Factory, and of course, with Power BI. They also introduce a lot of new functionality with this unified platform. And one of the selling points of Fabric is also that all the different components of Fabric are seamlessly integrated with one another. And when I say components of Fabric, what does that mean? So Fabric consists of 6 main workloads or core workloads. And those are the data factory workload, which is for data ingestion when you want to load data from somewhere into your analytics platform. We have the data engineering workload, which is for doing data transformation and data processing at a large scale. And it's the engine behind the data factory part is Apache Spark. We also have the data warehouse workload, which offers a SQL interface for processing and storing data, which might be familiar to a lot of people who's been working with maybe SQL in the past. We also have data science as a core workload, which helps you build and train and operationalize machine learning models. Fabric can also handle real-time data, so data that comes in at maybe high volumes and in an unstructured or semi-structured kind of way. The real-time intelligence workload is made for that. And then, of course, we have Power BI, which I'm guessing all of you are very familiar with, but that is, of course, Microsoft's visualization and analytics tool. just from the get-go, as you can see, Power BI is a part of Fabric. Fabric doesn't replace Power BI, nothing like that. Power BI is one of the core workloads of Fabric. So if you already know Power BI, you already know a pretty important part of Fabric, I would say. From these core workloads, we can also see that what Fabric is trying to do is serve everybody who is going to work with data within an organization, whether you're a data engineer or a data scientist or a business analyst or a business user in some way. Fabric is your one-stop shop, so to say, for everything you need to do within an analytics solution. We can also see from this slide that I stole from Microsoft that one of the foundations of Fabric is something called the One Lake. And One Lake is a data lake, which can store volumes, high volumes of both structured and unstructured data. And the name One Lake comes from the fact that for every Fabric tenant, there is only one Lake. There's exactly one Lake. And the One Lake is automatically provisioned with the Fabric tenants. Microsoft likes to brand the One Lake as the OneDrive for data, meaning that all of the data we're going to be using for analytics within our organization, they are going to be stored in the One Lake. Furthermore, all the different analytical engines of Fabric, so SQL and analysis services and Spark, they also store their data automatically to the One Lake. So if you're doing something in the data engineering workload and let's say you transform some data, you're going to store that data, it's going to be stored to the One Lake. And all of the analytical engines, they also store their data in the One Lake on the same data format, the Delta table format, or sometimes it's also referred to as Delta Parquet in the Microsoft documentation. But that means that when every part of Fabric store their data as the same type of a table, they can all talk to each other. You don't have to copy data from your data warehouse over to like a different format in order for the data science workload to work well with that data. All the different components of Fabric, they all speak the same language. Now, that was just a very, very brief introduction to Fabric as a platform. And I think maybe the best thing that we can do is just have a look inside Fabric and see what it actually looks like. So I'm going to try to Alt-Tab over to my other screen. That didn't work as intended. There we go. So in order to get to Fabric, you go to your favorite browser. Mine is Google Chrome, and you go to your URL part and you type fabric.microsoft.com, and it's going to redirect to app.fabric.microsoft.com. And if you've never done this before and you're prompted to log in with your Power BI credentials, because this is the same platform as you're used to when you go to the Power BI service. So this is sort of the home page, I guess, for Fabric. And as you can see, a lot of the same core workloads that I mentioned in my opening are readily available to us here. This particular homepage looks different today than it did yesterday. This industry solutions part is new to me, which is always great. Fabric releases new updates all the time. So your experience of Fabric is going to change sometimes from day to day. But I can start now and explore Fabric through sort of the role or the lens of one of these data roles. So let's say that I am a Power BI Pro and I want to see what does Fabric look like if I go through the Power BI experience. So I'm going to click Power BI over here. And anyone who's ever been inside Power BI service is going to see that this is just Power BI service. So what they've done with Fabric is that they saw that Power BI service is a really good thing. It's easy to navigate. It's like an intuitive kind of portal. Let's just expand Power BI service. And that is now the Fabric user interface. So when I'm in the Power BI experience of Fabric, I'm going to see stuff that is mostly related to Power BI when I'm at my homepage. If I'm a data engineer, let's say, I can change my sort of viewing experience of Fabric by going down to the left-hand side over here where my Power BI icon is. I'm going to click that, and all the different experiences that I can have with Fabric are just listed here. So if I go to the data engineering part, I'm going to be sent to the home page of Fabric for data engineering. And as you can see, this still looks like Power BI Service, because Power BI Service is just now what the Fabric user interface is. But some things that are different from the Power BI experience is that all the sort of recommended items that I get in this experience are related to data engineering. So Lakehouse and Notebook and data pipeline and stuff like that. And if I go down here and I change it to, let's say, the data science experience, I also have stuff that is related to data science in my recommended items to create and the get started part that I have here. And although these experiences might differ, the core concepts of Power BI Service have been brought over also to the Fabric user interface. So stuff like workspaces is still very much a core part of the Fabric user interface. And we also have all these different menu options that we'll also come to know and love with the Power BI Service. Now, this part right here, where you can change between the different experiences, that is going to change soon, I guess. I went to the European Fabric Community Conference about a month ago, and they showed us a couple of sneak peeks of things to come within the Fabric user interface. And one of the sneak peeks were that this part where you change between the different experiences is going to be simplified slightly. So there's going to be, I guess, two experiences, and that is the developer experience and the more like business analyst or data analyst experience. Nice. Let's jump back into my presentation. So we've now been discussing a little bit about Fabric, what it looks like and what it is, and we're going to go into what parts of Fabric are familiar to us right now. And we've already seen the Fabric user interface, and we can see that there is so much stuff in the Fabric user interface that is just Power BI Service just now expanded into Fabric. That's one of the things that you can sort of keep in mind that is pretty familiar to you. The other thing, which might seem obvious, but I think it's worth mentioning, Power BI is still Power BI. So if you know Power BI already, you know a lot about a very, very important part of Fabric. And that information or that knowledge that you have, that's not going to go away. It's key. It's going to keep they're going to keep adding stuff to Power BI, of course, but the things that you know about Power BI are still going to be relevant. They haven't changed Power BI all that much. They just brought it into Fabric. Some other parts of Fabric that are familiar to us that I thought that I would show you there are two things in particular. One is something called data flows that I think also a lot of people who've been working with Power BI are going to be pretty familiar with. That is now a part of the Data Factory workload. And we're going to look a little bit into something called visual queries, which is a part of the data warehouse experience. So without further ado, I'm just going to go straight into a demo again of the data flows experience. So I'm back in Fabric now, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to one of my workspaces that I've made for this presentation, which is called the demo workspace, very cleverly named, if I might say so myself. And again, just keep in mind that everything that I'm doing right now, I'm in Fabric doing this, but you might think that this just looks entirely like Power BI Service, which you would be right about. So in this demo workspace, I've already created a couple of different Fabric items, and we're going to go into those a little bit later. But let's say that I now want to load some data from my data source, and I want to put it into Fabric. What I can use for that is something called the data flow. So if I click New over here, I can go here and click the Data Flow Gen 2. And that's going to open up the sort of user interface for creating a new data flow right within Fabric. And anyone who's ever worked with Power Query is going to see that this is just Power Query in the cloud. And if you work with data flows before, this is not going to be new to you. So it even says Power Query up here in the right-hand corner. So if I want to load some data right now, I can go to this button called Import from a Text or CSV file, and I have a little bit of a cheat notepad here on my other screen. I'm going to link to a file that is on the GitHub for Microsoft Learning stuff. It's just a CSV file with some orders data. And once I've pasted that URL into this, I'm going to click Next. And then it's going to give me like a little a preview of the data within that file. So I can look it over and see if it looks right, if I've used the right delimiter, all that stuff. And then I can click Create. And there I have my orders table sort of beginning to be loaded and transformed within this data flow. And just as with Power Query, you can look over to the right-hand side and see all the different applied steps that you've had with this data. The source, we promoted the headers, and the data type was changed. And I can also use all these known functionalities from Power Query to do data transformation. I can add columns. I can view the data in different ways. So let's just add a column. I guess we can do add column and then add a custom column. I'm going to call it month number, and I'm going to paste the formula just to get the number of the month from the order date field. And let's set the data type as a whole number. And then I click OK, and we can see on the right-hand side under the applied steps, the added custom column step is going to be added, and I have my new column right here. And here you can do pretty much anything that you want to do to your data. If you want to look into the advanced editor and write your own code, as some people might prefer to do, you can do that right here, just as you would in Power BI Desktop working with Power Query. Now, this is just me connecting to a data source and doing some transformation, but at some point I want to load this data somewhere. So I need somewhere to put the data, a data destination, if you'd like. So down here in the right-hand corner, we have data destination, and right now there is no data destination selected, so I'll need to add a data destination. I'll click the little plus sign over here, and I get a couple of different options. I can load it into an Azure SQL database or in a Data Explorer, data warehouse within Fabric, or a lakehouse. And I've set up a lakehouse for doing exactly that. So I'm going to add or connect to that lakehouse, which is called, it's in the demo workspace, and it's called the demo lakehouse. And the table name for this table that I'm loading is, I'm gonna just let it remain as orders. So once I click next here, I am pretty much done. The last things I need to do is just check the column mapping, see that that looks all right. And right now we have something called use automatic settings, which has been turned on. If I turn that off, I get to see what the settings are like. And those are the update method and the schema options once you publish your data flow. So if I do replace as the update method, I also need to tell Fabric what I wanted to do with the schema. But if I choose append, that schema part just goes away. So let's choose append and click save settings. Now I have my data flow. I'm loading data from a source. I'm doing some very simple transformations to it, and I have somewhere to put it. So I'm just going to name my data flow, demo data flow, like that. And then I'm going to publish the data flow. Which just basically means save the data flow, and then you're going to see it starts running. And this is going to take like maybe a minute or half a minute or something like that. But once that one is done, we would be able to go into the demo lakehouse that I've set up, and we'll see that data that I've been loading from a CSV file on the GitHub is going to land in my demo lakehouse as a table. I'm not going to wait for that to do that now. You'll just have to trust me that that's going to be true. And we're going to see it later when we go back to the lakehouse. Right. That was a little bit about data flows. And just stop here for a minute and think about what we've just seen. Let's say we don't know anything about Fabric. All we know is Power BI. We now seen that with Fabric, a capability within the data factory workload, we can actually load data from somewhere into Fabric if we'd like, using what we already know about Power Query, which is pretty good. The next thing that I wanted to show you is something called visual queries, which is a part of the data warehouse experience. So I'm going to go back into my demo workspace in Fabric, and we're going to look into the demo warehouse that I've also set up. This warehouse, I've loaded a couple of tables into the warehouse. It's a customer table, a date table, a product table, and a fact table with some sales data. And let's now just imagine for a second that we don't really know a lot about data warehouses, but what we do know is that we want to explore the data that is in the data warehouse. So what I could do is, of course, that I could go up here to my to the menu at the top of the data warehouse, and there's a button here called New SQL Query. So if I click that, I get this this part of my screen where I can start to write some T-SQL. So if I know T-SQL, this is going to be perfect for me. I can just paste the T-SQL that I've already written for this. So let's say that I want to look at maybe the sales table. I want to see all the columns of the sales table, but I also want to see the product name from the product table. And the way I'm going to do that is just with a simple left join. If you know how to write T-SQL, this is pretty basic stuff. And I can run this query. And what we're going to see in a second is the data from the sales table, but we're also going to see the column that comes from the product table. So I can just pull that up here so we can see it a little better. And I can start to like explore this data, see what kinds of products and how they're selling and all that stuff. If I don't know how to write T-SQL, I am in a bit of a bind. Then I'll either need to start Googling how to write T-SQL. Maybe I can get Copilot to help me do that. But I can also leverage what I already know about Power BI in order to get the same result. And that would be, instead of doing the new SQL query up here, I would go to something called a new visual query. And this is very drag and drop friendly kind of thing. So it says here to build a query, just drag tables in here. So I'll drag maybe the fact sales order table in here, and I'll drag the DIM product table in here. And what I want to do is that from the fact sales order, I would like to add one of the columns from the DIM product table. So if I go here and click on this plus sign, I get all these different commands that I can do to this query. Choose columns, remove columns, I can filter the rows or keep the duplicates or do all kinds of things that I also already now can see. This is pretty much the same things that I can do with Power Query in Power BI Desktop. One of the things is the merge queries part. So let's say I want to merge the fact sales order query with the DIM product query. I want the product key to be the key column for these two. And once I click OK, I can see down here at the bottom that all the different columns from the fact sales order table is here, and the DIM product table is also in here. And I can choose to expand that one, and instead of keeping all of the columns, I'll unselect them and just keep the product name and click OK. And as I do that, we see that this query up here, it's going to expand. It's called visual queries for a reason, because it's a very visual thing. But this here is the exact same result that I got from writing this SQL query. Except I haven't written a single line of T-SQL in order to do this. I've only leveraged whatever I know already from Power Query inside Power BI to do this. And if you have a look just quickly up here at the different menu options, you're going to recognize a lot of them from Power Query. Choosing columns, reducing rows, sorting, group by and replace values. And of course, if I'd like, I can also view the things that I've now done visually as a SQL query. If I click edit for this one, it's going to open in its own window. So we can compare this one to the SQL that I wrote for this demo. Maybe my SQL is a little bit more compact and a little bit easier to read, but basically does the same thing. So if you don't know how to write T-SQL, but you do know how to do this, you can also have a peek at the T-SQL if you'd like to just see how is a SQL query built and what does it do compared to what I did with the visual query. Nice. Let's go back to my presentation. Just to give a very brief summary of the things we've talked about so far, the familiar concepts of Fabric. As I mentioned, Power BI is still Power BI. So Power BI is still going to be familiar to you, even though it's now in Fabric. If that was not the case, you would have probably noticed by now, because Fabric's been out for about a year and a half. So you would have noticed the big changes within Power BI. Power BI is still Power BI. We also saw that the Fabric user interface is built on Power BI Service. So all those core concepts that you know from Power BI Service are also going to be in the Fabric user interface. We also saw just quickly now that you have some existing knowledge probably of Power Query, which unlocks certain capabilities in Fabric. You can load data into Fabric using data flows, and you can also explore data within a data warehouse using the visual queries. And one thing that we haven't discussed, but I think is also an important point, that any existing knowledge that you have of the ETL process, meaning knowledge you have about ingesting data and what's important to think about there, the prepping and transformation of data, exploring data and visualizing data, even though you might have only done that within the context of Power BI before, that still applies to Fabric. You're still going to be loading data, prepping it, and exploring the data perhaps, and then visualizing it at the end. It's just that you now have a bigger platform with more powerful tools to do those things. Those were a little bit about the familiar concepts. What about the rest? Are the rest of these things that aren't data flows, visual queries, and Power BI, are they all new to us? And I think the answer to that depends a little bit on whether or not how you've been working with data in the past and Power BI in the past. If you've only ever been served transformed and prepared data, and all you've had to focus on is just creating a really, really, really good Power BI solution, then the rest of these might not be that familiar to you. But if you've maybe in your past been tasked with doing some data transformation or data prep or something like that that hasn't been strictly inside Power BI, then some of the other experiences might be familiar to you. Maybe the data warehousing experience that I just did a brief demo within, maybe that's familiar to you. So you can put that one in the I'm familiar with this column if you'd like. And if not, maybe you add that one to your little list of things that you might want to look into a little bit more. On the other end of that scale, we have the data science and the real-time intelligence workload. Whenever you're building an analytics solution, you're almost always going to have some ingestion of data, some data preparation, and you need to store it somewhere. Data science and real-time intelligence, on the other hand, are not necessarily a part of a standard analytics solution, meaning that might be unfamiliar to people who've only ever worked with Power BI. Data science might require a dedicated data scientist in order to leverage the right kind of knowledge to build a good data science solution. And the real-time intelligence is pretty specific use case. It's for real-time data. So those might be unfamiliar to people who've only ever worked with Power BI. And I think for me personally, if I was just about to expand into Fabric and familiarize myself with this new platform, these two might not be the ones that I would go for immediately. I would rather focus my attention on the workloads that represent the part of an analytics solution that is almost always going to be a part of a standard Fabric solution. And that is the data factory and the data engineering part, and of course, maybe the data warehouse. So within that, I want to point out a couple of capabilities that I think would be interesting for people to at least know a little bit about and maybe want to look into a little further if they want to really get to know Fabric and understand how a standard Fabric solution works. One thing that I am going to talk a little bit about is something called data pipelines, which is a part of the data factory workload. We are also going to have a little peek at something called the lakehouse, and we are going to have a little peek at something called notebooks. So let's just get right into it. Let's start with data pipelines. A data pipeline is a part of the data factory workload in Fabric, and it's mainly used for copying data from a source to a destination, and also for orchestrating the ETL process. And a data pipeline consists of some core concepts. The first one being something called activities. And if you look at the screenshots that I have here on the slide, those boxes, those are the activities of a data pipeline. And they can be copy data activity, they can be triggering a data flow or a notebook, or a couple of other things. And all these activities, they have something called parameters within them, which you can set according to what you want to do with your activity. And this means that you can actually make a data pipeline pretty metadata driven if you'd like. And once you've done setting up your data pipeline, you want to run all the activities in the order that you've set them up. We call that a pipeline run. So let's say that I want to build a data pipeline. I want to copy data from somewhere and put it into Fabric. I'll need somewhere to put it, just as I did with the data flow. I need somewhere to put it. And usually that is going to be a lakehouse. A lakehouse is used for storage, and the name lakehouse comes from it being a combination of a data lake and a data warehouse. It has the flexibility and the scale, as they say, of a data lake, meaning it can store high volumes of both structured and unstructured data and files and all that stuff. But it also has the data management and the structure that comes with a data warehouse for interacting with the data. And Fabric gives us a couple of ways to interact with a lakehouse. We have something called the Lakehouse Explorer, which we're going to see in a demo in a little bit. They also offer a SQL endpoint for the lakehouse, meaning that you can browse and read the data from the lakehouse using SQL if that is what you're most comfortable with. This SQL endpoint is read only. So if what you want to do is read the data and do some transformations with it and write that result back to the lakehouse, the SQL endpoint is not going to help you do that. For that, you are probably going to want to do this with a notebook. And a notebook is an interactive code interface. And I put it under the data engineering workload in one of my previous slides, but it is actually used for multiple workloads. You can use a notebook to ingest data. You can, of course, use it for data preparation and data transformation. And it's also an important part of the data science workload for doing machine learning. The notebooks in Fabric, they support a couple of different code languages. I've not listed all of them. I've listed the ones that I think maybe are the most common, and that would be PySpark, Spark SQL, and in preview right now, unless they changed it from preview to generally available, is the T-SQL notebook. So you can write an entire notebook using only T-SQL if you like. And notebooks are great if you're going to do complex transformations and if you're going to be handling high volumes of data. The notebook is going to do that better than, let's say, a data flow would do. The reason that I want to point out these three capabilities in particular, the data pipeline, the lakehouse, and the notebook, is not random. It's because these three, along with a couple of others, are going to be very important parts of what we would consider a pretty standard setup within Fabric. So I have a little bit of an architectural drawing right here, where once you want to build something within Fabric, you're probably going to have some data sources that you want to ingest data from and into your Fabric platform. And for that ingest, you might use data flows, pipeline, or notebooks to do that. Once you've ingested your data, you're going to store it somewhere. That is typically going to be the lakehouse. And then from the lakehouse, you're going to read the data, transform data, and write the results back to maybe another lakehouse using data flows or notebooks. And once you've prepared your data, maybe you have like a gold layer or a serving layer for business users, they are going to want to consume that data either by using Power BI through a semantic model or maybe through using the SQL Analytics endpoint for the lakehouse. So that is why those components might be nice to know about, because they're going to be a part of a pretty standard Fabric setup for an analytic solution. And of course, to orchestrate all of this, like triggering the data flows or the pipelines or the notebooks in the correct order and at the correct time, you also might be using a data pipeline to do that. So these three are pretty important capabilities of Fabric, along with, of course, Power BI and a couple of other things that we haven't discussed. We're not going to discuss, but if you know, you know, I guess. So let's just have a quick look at what these different capabilities look like within Fabric. So I am back in Fabric right now, and I'm going to jump back into my demo workspace. And as we can see, I have created a something called a demo pipeline, which is one of these data pipelines. And if I go into that one, this one is pretty simple. It only consists of one activity, and this activity is a copy activity. So it copies data from a source to a destination. And once I click the activity, I get all these options down here at the bottom. I can pull it up if I'd like. Just some general. Some of these different parts of the activity is mandatory, so it has to have a name. But a lot of these other things, they are optional. You don't have to fill them in, and they might be pre-filled for you. The source for this data is it's a CSV file on the GitHub for Microsoft Learning, and the destination, so where I want to land this data, is my demo lakehouse. And the demo lakehouse is whenever I choose demo lakehouse or a lakehouse as my destination, I can either put it in the lakehouse as the file, like the raw file that it came from, or I can write it to a table within the lakehouse. So for this example, I've chosen to land it in the files section of my lakehouse. And then I'll need to provide don't have to, but I provided a file path for the data. So this sales.csv file is going to land in a folder called new data within my lakehouse. And there are some other settings here as well that I'm not going to go into. But if I wanted to, I could run this right now. It would only run that one activity because there's only one activity within my pipeline. I could also, if I wanted to, expand this pipeline to do other things. Let's say that I want to do this copy data first, and after that, I want to trigger maybe my data flow. So I can click the data flow button up here, and this data flow activity shows up in my user interface. And for the data flow, I also need to give it a name. It has given itself a name, but let's call it trigger demo data flow. And within settings, I need to specify which data flow do I want to trigger and where does this data flow reside, which workspace. So I want to trigger the demo data flow that I created earlier, which is in my demo workspace. And I can say that when this copy data thing is successful, I want you to do the trigger data flow part. And I could also, if I wanted to, trigger a notebook. So let's say that I have a notebook right here. Same as with the data flow, I'll need to give it a name. Let's just keep it as notebook 1. And within settings, I need to specify which notebook do I want to trigger. And I could have loads and loads of notebooks here that I wanted to trigger from this pipeline. But I have one called demo notebook. And let's just say that in case this one fails, I want to trigger the notebook. And when all of this is done, maybe I want to trigger a different pipeline to sort of continue the work. So I have this thing called invoke pipeline, which I can also do. So let's say that when this notebook is successful, I want it to trigger another pipeline. And maybe once this data flow is successful, so in case it doesn't fail, but it's green, I can make it go directly to invoking that pipeline. So this is how you build a pipeline, and you can do this for orchestrating your entire ETL process if you'd like, using these different activities and these different sort of flows of work. I'm going to delete these, and I'm just going to demonstrate to you what happens if I run this pipeline with this one activity in it. So if I click run, it's going to ask me to save first because I did some changes. So I'll click save and run. And what we're going to see right down here in the now blank part is how we're doing with this pipeline. Right now, it's queued, so it's waiting to be executed. And this is going to update itself every couple of seconds. But once it starts running, we're going to see that this goes from queued to in progress. And depending on whether or not it's going to work or fail, we're going to see either succeeded or failed as the activity status once it's done running. And this doesn't take that long. It takes maybe a minute, I guess. Oh, there we are. Succeeded, which means that we successfully copy data from this source into our files destination in our lakehouse. So if I go back here to my workspace and I go into the demo lakehouse, I can see that under the file section right here in the folder called new data, there is a sales.csv, and that was copied at 1:40 p.m., which is right now Oslo time. So this is what we just did. And what I also did a little bit earlier was just that I loaded this CSV to tables using the load to tables functionality. So I can also go, instead of going in here and clicking the CSV file and seeing sort of the raw file format, I can view it in a more table structured way. This is what we call the Lakehouse Explorer. So you can explore the tables and the files within your Lakehouse like this. But as I also mentioned, the Lakehouse offers us a SQL endpoint that we can use to read the data using SQL if we'd like. So if I go up here to the top right-hand corner, I can switch from the Lakehouse Explorer view to the SQL Analytics endpoint view. And if you remember my demo of the data warehouse experience, you might think this looks pretty familiar to the data warehouse experience. And that is because it is the same experience. But from here, I can, let's say, right-click my sales table, new SQL query, and just select top 100. And I can start to write T-SQL to explore these tables that I have in my Lakehouse if I wish. Sorry. Now, the last thing that we discussed was the notebook. And notebook might be, at least it was for me. I've never worked with notebooks previously, so that was a new experience for me. But a notebook, as I said, is an interactive code interface. So I have a demo notebook here that I've created and just filled in with some code. But the way a notebook works is that it has these areas of code or code cells, if you like, where you can write your code. And you can choose to write code and then run only that part of the code. And then you can move on and write the next part of the code and only run that part of the code and sort of iteratively, in iterations, build up your code. And as I mentioned, the notebook supports a couple of different code languages. PySpark and Spark SQL are pretty common. We also have Spark for Scala and Spark for R. And then this T-SQL, as I also mentioned, which, as far as I know, is still in preview. I have some couple of examples right here. This code cell right here has some PySpark. So if you know how to write Python or PySpark, you're going to be pretty familiar with this one. You can also, if you like, write SQL, and it's pretty simple switching between the languages. You'll use this little magic thing up here, or you can also go down to the right-hand corner and switch between the different programming languages, and you can have different programming languages within the same notebook. The notebook also supports Markdown, meaning that you can write text, so you can have both documentation maybe and code within the same notebook. And if I look at the Markdown cell right here, it looks like this. So if you know how to write Markdown, this is pretty familiar, I guess, to you. If you don't know how to write Markdown, it's not difficult. So this will be an easy one for you to learn. But this is what it looks like as code, kind of. But once I click the preview button here, you see that you can have headings and subheadings and even smaller headings. You can highlight text, make it bold, italicized, or underline. You can put links in here if you want to link to something outside of the notebook. You can have bullet points, and you can also include cute images if you are maybe a really bad coder and you need your colleague to look at your code. You can put in some cute images so that they don't go insane from your horrible code. Let's jump back to my PowerPoint. Just to summarize what we've been talking about with the new concepts, I didn't maybe say this part out loud, but doing the ETL process outside of Power BI and within Fabric instead, using these capabilities, sort of enables you to do ETL at scale. For ingestion, you can use data pipelines, which is a low-code option for doing ingestion. And data flows is also a low-code, no-code option for doing ingestion. Or you can do it really code-centric if you'd like with notebooks. We talked a little bit about the lakehouse used for storage, and also they can do transform with notebooks. And we only touched briefly on the data science and real-time intelligence workloads, but those are also probably going to be pretty unfamiliar and new to people who have worked a lot with Power BI and maybe not a lot with real-time data or data science. Up until now, when we've been discussing new functionality, I have been focusing strictly on new stuff that is not Power BI centric, but there's of course some new Power BI related functionality within Fabric that I think is worth mentioning. There's actually a lot, and I'm only going to be mentioning 3 different ones. I think the first one, if you have been paying attention, is not going to come as a surprise, but that is the direct lake mode for Power BI semantic models. Prior to Fabric, there were 2 main ways of getting data into Power BI. It was direct query mode and import mode. And direct query mode, with that one, you sort of just set up a connection between your semantic model and your data source. And whenever you click something, you need something rendered within your Power BI report, a query is being sent from the semantic model and down to your data source. And the data source needs to collect all the data and send it back up to Power BI. The advantage of this is that your Power BI report will be as up to date as your data sources. So if data keeps coming into your data source, your Power BI report will reflect that, and it'll be real-time-ish, depending on how real-time your source is. The downside of that is that this isn't fast. So the response and the performance of the model isn't as great as, let's say, with import mode. And with import mode, you actually copy the data from the data source into Power BI, which makes it really fast because the engine doesn't have to go down to the data source and get the data and go back up. The data resides in memory. But if you want new data in your data model, you need to refresh your semantic model. So it's latent and duplicative, but it's fast. Direct lake mode sort of I don't know, Microsoft promises that direct lake mode is like the perfect combination kind of these, in the sense that direct lake mode aims to be real time, but also pretty fast. And the reason this works is that when you have a semantic model in the direct lake mode and you need some data, the engine sends, or the query from the engine goes down to the OneLake and can read the files in OneLake directly and then produce a response in the report. And the reason this works is that the way a table is being stored in Power BI when you use import mode is pretty similar to the way a Delta table is stored in OneLake. So with just like a little bit of a tweaking, Microsoft was able to make the Power BI engine read the Delta tables almost directly, which makes this faster than direct query. Not as fast as import mode, I don't think, but it's also pretty real time because it keeps reading the files that are actually in the OneLake. Now, I think this direct lake mode was pretty hyped when it was announced back in 2023. And way smarter people than me have since done extensive tests on direct lake mode. And there are a lot of good blog posts and YouTube videos about this. So direct lake mode doesn't replace direct query or import mode. It's just another mode that you can use that might be right for some situations, and import mode and direct query will be the right choice for other situations. So just do your research before you jump into this. Yes. Next part I wanted to talk a little bit about is source control with Git. I think people who have been working with Power BI for a while, and especially if sort of your Power BI environment has been growing, you've been looking for a way to do proper version control and collaboration on your Power BI reports. And we've made do with what we have. People have been using SharePoint, for example, to keep being control of the versions of the Power BI reports and semantic models. But now with Fabric, we are getting integration with Git, proper source control with Git. That means that you can back up and version your semantic models and your reports. You can compare changes that you make to your files if you make a change in your report or in your semantic model. If you need to, you can revert to a previous version, and collaboration with others is going to be much, much easier once you have proper integration with Git in your setup. The way that you get this to work with Power BI is that when you're working with a Power BI file on your Power BI desktop, you need to save the file as a Power BI project, a PBIP, instead of a PBIX. What this does is that it saves the report and the semantic model as text files that you can interact with. They are human readable and they keep getting better, and it allows for editing the text files directly, so you don't have to do everything within Power BI Desktop with the drag and drop. You can do a lot more within the actual text file, which means that you can also maybe automate some of the things that you do with a Power BI report. This is just a visual of how working with Git and Power BI works. So you would be on your Power BI desktop on your laptop, and you would save that work as a PBIP, or Power BI project. And then you can hook that up to a Git repo. So whenever I do a change in my Power BI desktop, I'll commit that to Git and send it or push it to wherever I'm hosting this Git repo. Azure DevOps or GitHub are the ones that are supported right now. And I can also connect that Git repo in Azure DevOps, let's say, to a workspace in Fabric or in Power BI Service, whatever you want to call it. So if I do a change in my desktop, I'll commit it to Git. I can push it to the repo at Azure DevOps, and I can sync it to my workspace so that people who are looking at whatever is in the workspace is going to see the change that I did, which is very, very cool and a lot better for collaboration than having to sort of coordinate who is working on the file at any given time. Great update for Power BI users, I would say. As I mentioned previously, I went to the European Fabric Community Conference about a month ago. Great conference, by the way. Would absolutely recommend anyone go there. But there was, of course, a lot of talk about Copilot. You can't really escape Copilot these days. So instead of fighting Copilot, let's just find a way to make it work for us, which I think we can absolutely do. For business users, Copilot can right now generate a report summary for you. But if you are a report author or a Power BI Pro, Power BI developer, there are a couple of more things that Copilot can help you with. It can generate a summary for the semantic model. It can generate entire report pages. It can answer questions about data in the model and add descriptions to the measures in the model. So if you're not great at documenting your measures, maybe this can help. And it can also help you write DAX queries. There are a couple of limitations, however, with Copilot. First of all, it does require an F64 capacity or Power BI Premium, and it has to be a paid capacity. So the trial capacities, even though they are F64, are not going to give you Copilot. And it also requires that you do some cleanup on the semantic model before you can start using Copilot. Otherwise, it's not going to work properly. You need cleared relationships between your tables. You need to standardize the measure logic a little bit. You also need to be consistent in your naming conventions, and also all the names that you give stuff needs to be descriptive and unambiguous. And that could be stuff like, instead of using prod ID for a product ID, you would rather use product name so that Copilot can actually read the product, the column name, and understand that this is what identifies a product. And this is what Copilot will look like if you have it in the Power BI service or the Fabric user interface. It's going to be like a little friend on your right-hand side that you can chat with, that can help you do all these kinds of things. And I'm not psychic, but I think maybe Microsoft is going to keep expanding the Copilot experience for us. Great. Our hour is almost up, so let's just have a little bit of a look at what we did this past hour. We started out with looking at some familiar concepts in Power BI. Power BI is still Power BI, so that is going to be familiar to you. The Fabric user interface is just the same as Power BI service, so that is going to be familiar to you. We know now that we can ingest data using data flows that we already know from Power Query, and we can also explore data in the data warehousing experience using visual queries, because that also looks like Power Query. Then we had a look at some unfamiliar workloads and items. We had a look at the lakehouse, data pipelines, and notebooks, and we also touched just briefly on the data science and the real-time intelligence workloads. And then now, just a couple of minutes ago, we had a little bit of a talk on what the direct lake mode is, how you can do source control and the collaboration using Git and Power BI projects. And then in true AI era fashion, we rounded out the session talking a little bit about Copilot. We didn't cover a lot of stuff. I could have probably included 15 more things in this session that would have been nice to talk about. We could have talked about Data Activator, which is a way to do like recognizing patterns and meeting criteria in your data and actually acting on those in an automated way. We could have talked about semantic link labs and semantic link, which are Python libraries that you can use to do a lot of Power BI automation. We could have talked about the PBIR format, which is sort of a upgraded version of the Power BI project. We could have talked about the tabular model definition language. We didn't mention anything about database mirroring or shortcuts when we were talking about the data integration, data factory part. We haven't mentioned any certifications or exams that you need to be looking into if you want to get to know Fabric a little more. And we haven't actually discussed anything about the capacities or the license that you need to work with Fabric. And there's loads more. And I just want to leave you guys with a couple of words of wisdom about that. This session was meant as an introduction to somebody who knows Power BI, who want to know more about Fabric. And I just want to reiterate, if you are a Power BI professional, you already know a lot about Fabric. So if you're like trying to become a fabricator, as we would call them, you are already a fabricator. And whenever something is new and exciting like Fabric is, it's very easy to think that I need to be knowing everything about Fabric, otherwise I'm behind. The thing is that not everybody can or should be an expert in everything, because if we try to do that, we are going to end up like Bilbo Baggins, guys, and we don't want that, not at least in this particular situation where he feels thin and stretched like butter scraped over too much bread. So let's not do that. But if you do want to learn more about Fabric, there are some really, really great resources out there for you. Microsoft documentation and learning paths are always a good way to start out. There are so many good blogs out there, people who are so dedicated to Fabric and the data community within Microsoft that write really, really good blog posts about basically everything and anything. Same goes for YouTube. There are a lot of great YouTube videos out there with really good demos that show you how you actually do things and work with the different capabilities in Fabric. I actually listened to a podcast about Power BI, which I think is very nerdy, but sometimes nice to just hear people talking loosely about something that you enjoy. And of course, attend conferences and talks like this one. But the best tip is always get your hands dirty. Go in there and try it out. That's the absolute best way to learn. And I think with that, I'll say thank you so much for attending my session. And thank you to the organizers, William and Ben, for this opportunity. I have had fun. I hope you guys had too.